Number 9. Mendeleev Tank. Vasily Mendeleev came up with the idea for a so-called land ship that would be impenetrable to enemy fire. The idea came to him during his time at an engineering school in St. Petersburg from 1911 to 1915, when tank technology was in its infancy. Known as the Mendeleev Tank, it looked like a giant box with a huge 120mm naval gun protruding from the front. If it had surpassed the design stage, it would have been one of the heaviest tanks of all time, weighing nearly as much as the German World War II-era German Panzer Mark VIII Maus Super Heavy Tank. With the gun attached, the Mendeleev tank would have been almost 43 feet long and 14.5 feet with the gun turret up. It would be more or less a mobile artillery platform and would require a crew of 8 to 12 operators. For its time, the Mendeleev tank was exceptionally heavily armored, with much thicker steel plating than the tanks that were used in World War I. The design failed to garner the backing it needed to reach the construction stage. Mendeleev tried to build it himself, but the vehicle only ever existed in the forms of drawings and designs. Number 8. The Dead Hand. The perimeter system, known to the West as the Merdvaya Ruka or the Dead Hand, was designed in the 1970s. With the ability to automatically strike back against a nuclear attack, it's been referred to by some as Russia's doomsday weapon. The weapon was designed as a way for the Soviet Union to retaliate in the event it was impossible to operate a nuke the traditional way. This could happen if an attacking nuke wiped out Russia's commanding forces, or if the standard control channels of strategic nuclear forces were blocked by radio-electronic warfare. In other words, no matter how devastated the USSR was by an attack, it was a guarantee that they would strike back. Engineers designed an intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM, that, when launched, would trigger all other ICBMs on Soviet territory. To ensure that the Dead Hand missile itself wasn't destroyed, it would be housed in a silo that could withstand a nuclear hit. It would also be pre-programmed with flight coordinates and radio signals that it would communicate to other missiles should the system be activated. Test flights proved successful, and in 1985 the Soviet military officially adopted the weapon. It's still in use today in case tensions between Russia and other countries come to nuclear blows, and there are plans to implement hypersonic missiles as the technology develops. Number 7. Biological Weapons Program. From the 1920s to the early 1990s, the Soviet Union carried out the longest, biggest, and most sophisticated biological weapons program of any country ever. It was, and still is, extremely secretive, so the Western world knows limited details about it. As Nazi Germany advanced into Russia in 1942, Joseph Stalin may have used tularemia, also known as rabbit fever, against the invading troops. The biological weapons program only expanded during the Cold War, even after the USSR signed the 1972 Biological Weapons Convention, which called for the disarmament of these types of facilities. Throughout the lifespan of the program, the Soviets weaponized and stockpiled over a dozen bioagents. This included anthrax, plague, brucellosis, smallpox, an uncommon bacterial infection called Q fever, a horse disease called Venezuelan equine encephalitis virus, and another equine sickness called glanders. These agents were developed at dozens of top-secret testing sites throughout the Soviet Union, and they were produced and stored in huge amounts. Smallpox, for example, had an annual production capacity of 90 to 100 tons. Later on in the program, in the years leading up to the Soviet collapse, the bioagents were altered to resist heat, cold, and antibiotics. And these pathogens affected the local populations who lived near clandestine testing sites. In 1979, at least 66 people died from the accidental release of anthrax in the city of Sverdlovsk. But the Soviets covered up these incidents as best they could, and it wasn't until 1992 that Boris Yeltsin admitted to what really happened and to the existence of the biological weapons program. That same year, Russia signed a trilateral agreement with the US and the UK, with all three countries promising to end these types of programs and replace them with more well-intending efforts. But oversight of the agreement is lacking, and it's suspected that Russia had continued to experiment with biological weapons since then. Number 6. The Fire Hedgehog. Toward the end of World War II, two Red Army ground soldiers came up with the idea of attaching an automatic submachine gun to the bottom of a bomber. They affixed a gun called the PPSH-41 to the underbelly of a Tupolev Tu fighter plane. The gun was popular and easy to use, and the aircraft was widely favored for similar reasons. But when the two were put together, the results were far less than ideal. Known as the Fire Hedgehog, the weapon system involved loading a removable cassette with 11 rows of guns, with 8 guns in each row. Once engaged by the pilot, all 88 guns would begin firing simultaneously, with each gun shooting as many as 900 rounds per minute. The system was only tested on one plane, and it quickly proved to be flawed. In theory, the Fire Hedgehog was a great idea, given its potential to fire over 79,000 rounds per minute. But each gun was only loaded with enough ammunition to fire for 4 seconds before needing to be reloaded. This amounted to roughly 6,000 rounds, which was still enough firepower to do some considerable damage. Still, even just loading the guns took a lot of work, amounting to roughly 100 man-hours. And firing so many of them came with the possibility of getting spent shell casings in the plane's engine or jamming other guns within the system. In order to deploy the guns with the possibility of actually shooting anything on the ground, the plane had to fly below 800 feet, putting the aircraft within easy reach of most German weapons. For this reason alone, the Fire Hedgehog was deemed to be too dangerous for further development. Do you think the Fire Hedgehog would be possible today with modern technology? Tell us in the comments and hit the subscribe button while you're at it. Number 5. Poison-shooting umbrella. Among the many Soviet spy weapons that were disguised as everyday items was the Bulgarian umbrella. It looked no different from the standard umbrella that any other person uses to shield themselves from the rain, but it was equipped with a sharp injector that could be used for stabbing an enemy. In addition to obviously being painful, it administered a single ricin pellet into the target's body, and it would only take a short time to kill the unfortunate recipient. The appropriately nicknamed weapon was used to assassinate Bulgarian dissident writer Georgy Markov in 1978. Markov had fled the Soviet Union for London, but he was ultimately unable to avoid the Bulgarian secret police and the KGB, who teamed up to plot his murder. He was on the Waterloo Bridge when his assassin stabbed him in the leg with the umbrella, and he died 3 days later. It was the only known case of the Bulgarian umbrella ever being used, but it's entirely possible that it was used in other instances that the West doesn't know about. Number 4. Typhoon and Borai class submarines. Measuring 575 feet long each, the Soviet-made Typhoon class submarines are the largest submarines ever built. Also known under the designated Soviet Project 941 Akula, 6 of these gargantuan nuclear-powered ballistic missile ships were built for the Soviet Navy between the late 1970s and the late 1980s. Each submarine had enough room to accommodate a crew of 160 for a month's time. The only remaining Typhoon-class submarine still in service today is the first one ever built, the Dmitry Donskoy, which functions as a missile testing platform. 2 other Typhoon subs, the Archangelisk and Severstal, remain on reserve in case they're ever needed, but are not actively in service. Since 2010, most Typhoons have been replaced with the newer Borai-class submarines. At 557 feet long, these modern vessels are nearly as long as their predecessors. Design work on the Borai class started in the 1980s, and construction on the first vessel began in 1996. The submarines first entered service in 2013. They represent some of the Russian Navy's most advanced technology and are enabling the military to patrol southern latitudes that have not seen a Russian missile submarine in 2 decades. The Cold War ended during the 90s, but the continued development of nuclear submarine technology proves that the competition between the US and Russia for military superiority remains strong. The new Borai-class submarines are part of Russia's nuclear deterrent force, which was put on high alert in early 2022 amid the country's invasion into Ukraine. The Borai-class subs that serve on the nuclear deterrent force are joined by 4 newly developed Khabarovsk-class submarines. Each Khabarov sub is equipped with 6 nuclear-powered drone torpedoes that are capable of traveling across oceans and hitting coastal cities and military bases. These bombs are powerful enough to do 10 times more damage than the nuclear weapons that the US dropped on Japan during World War II. As tensions escalate between Putin's government and the growing number of countries who disagree with his recent actions, the nuclear deterrent force is ready to respond on a moment's notice to any perceived aggression from NATO forces. And while many people believe that current diplomatic tensions are nowhere close to reaching the point of nuclear blows, the world's superpowers remain prepared for the possibility. Number 3. Lipstick gun. Considering the inherently secretive nature of Cold War efforts in both the Soviet Union and the US, the full variety of weapons possessed by either superpower may never be known. And since a lot of spying went on, one of the priorities among the Soviets was to equip its operatives with weapons that looked like everyday items, including things that could be carried across international borders without triggering suspicion. One of these weapons, known as the Kiss of Death, was confiscated by guards along the border between East and West Germany in 1965. Disguised as a tube of lipstick, it held a single 4.5mm bullet and was fired by pressing the barrel into the victim. It would have been impossible to reload after being used, leading experts to believe it was issued to female spies as a last-ditch weapon. Only one Kiss of Death was ever seized by Western forces, so it's unclear how many were made or how widely carried it was. The weapon is on display at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. Number 2. 2B1 Oka. Before guided missile delivery systems emerged during the Cold War arms race, both the Soviet Union and the United States experimented with different forms of unguided delivery. As a result, the USSR designed one of the largest artillery guns ever made, the 421mm 2B1 Oka, in response to the development of the American atomic Annie gun. The experimental model, completed in 1957, was capable of firing a 1,650-pound projectile at a range of up to 28 miles. Its cannon was bigger than the 406mm guns that operated as the main battery of American Iowa-class battleships. But along with its advantages came several shortcomings. For one, it had a huge recoil, and firing it unavoidably destroyed its chassis. It required a 7-person crew and was both complex and labor-intensive to operate, limiting its firing rate to 1 round every 5 minutes. Due to the length of its barrel, the gun was extremely difficult to transport, and its single 12-cylinder engine struggled against the weapon's massive weight. The complications associated with the weapon were enough for the Soviets to halt any further development of oversized artillery pieces. They abandoned the 2B1 Oka project in 1960 and began focusing on newer ways of firing nuclear missiles. And at number 1, the T35 Heavy Tank. The Soviet Union was just one of several nations that experimented with tank technology during the interwar period, especially as the prospect of World War II became increasingly imminent and realistic. One of the new vehicles that came was the Super Heavy Tank, also known as the land ship. These vehicles were meant to be moving fortresses that were impenetrable to enemy fire, and although the concept was first experimented with as early as 1911, super heavy tanks didn't go into production until the 1930s. The first Soviet version of the machine was the T35. It was the only 5-turret tank in the world to ever enter the production phase, and its turrets were capable of firing in all directions. The main turret was equipped with a standard tank cannon, while the 4 other turrets housed smaller cannons and guns. But its use was short-lived, mainly because it was slow and mechanically unreliable. Due to its weight, the T-35 had a top speed of just 20 miles per hour. The 32-foot-long vehicle was also deceptively large. Inside, it was extremely cramped. Very few T-35s were built to begin with, and more were lost due to engine failure than enemy action. The tank saw limited service under the Red Army in World War II, but it fell out of favor due to being impractical and because it was quickly rendered obsolete. Most of the T-35s that were still operational in 1941 were lost during the German invasion of the Soviet Union, known as Operation Barbarossa. Thanks for watching. Which one of these crazy Soviet weapons shocked you the most? Tell us in the comments below, and don't forget to hit subscribe. See you next time.